Hey everyone, and welcome to the War Room, where I'm going to be taking a look at strategy, tactics, wars, campaigns, operations, battles, weapons, generals, and whatever else that I think seems interesting. And because I've been playing a lot of the Rising Storm 2 Vietnam beta, I thought I'd kick off with something about the Vietnam War, specifically the American strategy of search and destroy. The US military was sent to South Vietnam to stop the country from falling to communism at the hands of the North Vietnamese. This is the Cold War. The last thing the Americans want is the opposing ideology to spread, but at the same time they also wanted to avoid escalating the conflict. Back in the Korean War, the US and UN had come to the aid of a South Korea attacked by Communist North, but by defeating North Korean forces and pushing them all the way up to the Chinese border, they provoked a response by the Chinese that seriously widened the conflict. Vietnam looked like a similar situation, with the added threat of nuclear escalation, so the US military was heavily restricted in what it could do by Washington. In particular, there would be no ground invasion of North Vietnam. And this meant that US forces in South Vietnam were condemned to the strategic defensive. In other words, all they could do was hang around in South Vietnam and take whatever the North Vietnamese could throw at them. That's not exactly a recipe for success. It's like playing a game of football without being allowed to cross the halfway line. But Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV under General Westmoreland, was determined to do the best job it could under the circumstances, and they decided that their best option was to make North Vietnamese operations in South Vietnam so costly and painful that the communist leadership in Hanoi would give up. Obviously, MACV were working under serious restrictions, but the glaringly obvious problem with such a strategy is that it is fundamentally passive. Whether or not the US succeeded in stopping communist infiltration and attacks in South Vietnam rested entirely with the hands of the North Vietnamese, and given that they themselves weren't threatened, the North Vietnamese weren't going to just give up and admit defeat if they got a bloody nose down in South Vietnam. This isn't to say that Westmoreland and MACV didn't know what they were doing. They did, and they expected their strategy to take a long time, and they continually pushed for an invasion of North Vietnam, but nobody in the White House was prepared to take the risk. So that's the broad outline of the search and destroy strategy, but how did it pan out on the ground? Despite being restricted to the strategic defensive, the point of search and destroy operations was entirely offensive. US troops were to get out into the jungle, the highlands, the rice fields, wherever, find the enemy and destroy him. The combination of helicopter-based mobility and gratuitous firepower courtesy of aviation and artillery was going to add up to a volume of attrition that would make the Vietnamese go home and stay there. This is a very conventional strategy which doesn't fit very well with the Vietnam War's image as an unconventional insurgency-focused conflict. The argument runs that the American forces should have focused on pacification, on winning hearts and minds, and on the counterinsurgency challenges of the interior. And while in hindsight that may or may not have been a more productive choice of action, there was undoubtedly a conventional aspect to the war. Yes, the Viet Cong were operating in villages throughout South Vietnam, but in the less densely inhabited border areas, there were North Vietnamese army divisions and regiments essentially invading the country. There was full-on conventional light infantry warfare going on out in the border regions. On top of this, there were also a lot of biases within the US Army itself that naturally skewed their attitudes in favour of conventional thinking and conventional warfare. This is an army standing by to defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union, a conventional army prepared to fight a conventional war that suddenly finds itself on the wrong side of the world doing something completely different. In a lot of ways, the Vietnam War came across as a distraction. In the words of one US general, "I'll be damned if I see the US Army, its history, its doctrine, its institutions alter just to win this lousy war." So to some extent, you have a kind of confirmation bias in the US Army. Because they're prepared to fight conventionally, they want to fight conventionally, and because they can interpret the situation in a way that lets them justify fighting conventionally, that's what they're going to do. Whenever the US engaged NVA or VC forces in a stand-up fight, they inflicted wildly disproportionate casualties at landing zone X-ray in the Idrang Valley, for example, the American 7th Cavalry lost 79 men dead, while the NVA lost between 634 and 1,215. Military Assistance Command Vietnam could point to the search and destroy body count as evidence that they were winning the war, that they were inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy. In reality, North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong units were generally free to choose when and where the fighting started and finished. The two pillars of American doctrine in Vietnam, mobility and firepower, were to some degree actually illusions. While helicopters might allow US troops to move quickly between areas of operations and to maneuver around the battlefield at speed, they were seriously limited by the availability of landing zones and susceptible to ambush. Measures to offset these advantages, such as using daisy cutters to blast new LZs, using artillery and air support to destroy or suppress enemy forces lying in wait, gave North Vietnamese forces advanced warning of American intentions. US troops lost the mobility their helicopters gave them once they were actually on the ground, and North Vietnamese units with a head start could generally activate their escape plans and disperse into the jungle, bypassing or outrunning heavily laden US infantry. In terms of firepower, of course, when the North Vietnamese attacked American fire bases and defensive positions, they suffered heavily, just like everybody else who exposes themselves to heavy artillery, machine guns, mines, napalm, automatic cannon fire and carpet bombing. But it was the North Vietnamese who chose to attack, and out on mobile operations where US infantry was trying to find the enemy in dense terrain, it was the enemy who held a lot of the cards. To begin with, how much firepower could US units actually put out at the sharp end? Essentially, they're limited to small arms fire, M14s or M16s, M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, and light anti-tank weapons. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units are armed in a similar fashion. They also have assault rifles, machine guns, grenade launchers, and light anti-tank weapons. More to the point, because the Americans were generally advancing to contact, the North Vietnamese were able to ambush them. In other words, they could exploit the advantages of concealment, fire discipline, and prepared positions to surprise the enemy. An NVA unit could kick off a firefight with its maximum firepower. The Americans, on the other hand, had to build up their fire from scratch. They had to spot enemy positions, move up and deploy their heavier weapons, and start trying to claw back fire superiority while they were being pinned down. The real advantages in US firepower were not at the sharp end of most engagements. Heavy artillery and air support took time to call in. They required precise locations for US units and targets that were difficult to get in dense terrain, and they were frequently confounded by an enemy which did its best to stay as close as possible to US units so that artillery support would cause friendly fire casualties. Even when heavy artillery, helicopter gunships and airstrikes were called in, they weren't always effective. If you look at something like Hamburger Hill, when the NVA were dug into a static position that could be freely bombarded, it still took 10 days of hard fighting by ground troops to physically destroy the enemy in their holes, trenches and bunkers, despite the fact that the Americans poured artillery fire, bombs, napalm and rockets onto the hill. And to cap it all off, just like so many engagements in Vietnam, once they reached the summit, they found that most of the enemy had disappeared overnight. In the words of Philip Caputo, who was a Marine platoon leader in Vietnam, the average engagement started with an ambush and ended inconclusively. So, in the kind of tactical engagements that characterized the war, American firepower and mobility were actually comparable and in many situations worse than that of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, and this influenced the ways the Americans fought. They began the war with a doctrine of fire and maneuver. Find the enemy, fix him in place with fire, and flank or advance to close with him and destroy him. But it quickly turned out to be too difficult to actually build up the kind of fire superiority that would allow maneuver, and this, combined with the sheer volume of support available to even small US units and an obsession with evacuating casualties, led to a change in doctrine. The US Army stopped performing fire and maneuver and started performing maneuver and fire. American units would advance to contact or advance to ambush, stop, return fire, assume an all-round defensive position and call for support. The North Vietnamese, meanwhile, could simply ambush US troops and then disengage when things got too hot. In the words of a Rand Corporation report in 1970, the enemy initiates contact most of the time and avoids it when he desires. He therefore controls his own rate of casualties, negating any strategy based on attrition. So even though the Americans could and did inflict wildly disproportionate casualties, it was the North Vietnamese who chose to suffer them. They were the ones who held the initiative both strategically and tactically, and they were willing to fight the Americans despite their losses. In other words, the deterrent effect of casualties caused by search and destroy operations was pretty much non-existent, and it simply wasn't going to achieve the political objectives of the United States in Vietnam. But to Military Assistance Command Vietnam, if they were driving the enemy off the battlefield and inflicting heavy casualties on him, then they were winning. The US Army was able to convince itself it was winning, and they were able to convince the White House that they were winning, and they were able to convince the American people that they were winning, all the way up to 1968 and the Tet Offensive, where the whole illusion disintegrated. Tet was in many ways a dream military scenario for US forces in Vietnam. Suddenly the enemy stopped hiding, came out of the woodwork en masse, and conducted assaults all across South Vietnam that allowed American forces to destroy them. Tet was a military disaster for the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, but politically it was a great success. Clearly, to the American public, if the enemy were able to mount such a large offensive, the United States was not winning the war, and the search and destroy strategy obviously wasn't working. Tet simultaneously discredited General Westmoreland and McVie and galvanized the anti-war movement in the United States. Over the next year, search and destroy operations trailed off, and the United States began to concentrate on building up the South Vietnamese army and getting out of the country. The real problem with search and destroy was that it was not a strategy that could achieve US political objectives in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, it's impossible to say what they could have done to secure South Vietnam from communist aggression. A full-on counterinsurgency campaign, for example, would have required huge numbers of troops and left North Vietnamese army units operating in the border regions comparatively unmolested. And you can argue that the insurgency aspect of the war wasn't as important as it might have appeared. When South Vietnam finally fell in 1975, it wasn't because of a general uprising by Viet Cong insurgents. It was because conventional North Vietnamese army units crossed the demilitarized zone in force and destroyed the South Vietnamese army in a conventional fight. But that's a whole different can of worms. I'm not going to claim that I'm some kind of Vietnam expert, guys. I'm relying on my own very distant, non-American, history-based viewpoint here, and I'm well aware that it's very complicated and that I haven't touched on everything. I'm sure there'll be people out there who will let me know exactly how wrong I am and tell me what I missed out, but hopefully you guys found that interesting, a bit of a change. Hopefully I'm going to be doing more videos like this in the future. Have a good day, guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.